Dr. Dunn, for hosting this very important discussion. And as we have visited on several different occasions, I want to publicly commend you for your dedication, for fighting for the right thing to do, for your deep compassion for the people that you represent, and the tireless effort that you're making to explain the consequences of Hurricane Michael as it hit you, the floods that have hit us, the wildfires that have hit others. Thank you so much for the time and for your leadership. Madam Speaker, when spring approaches Nebraska, we expect our rivers and streams to peacefully rise as snow from the nearby Rockies gently melts. We are the Cornhusker state, but we actually could be called the river state, and here's why. We have more miles of rivers than any other state in the Union. The Missouri, the Platte, the Republican, the Elkhorn, and Niobrara are our most famous rivers, but we really don't think of them as threatening until they are. So, as General Bacon just said, this was the most destructive storm in most Nebraskans' lifetimes. A perfect storm of factors caused the pain and destruction now all around us. Lands that were soaked from earlier autumn rains were frozen solid, then covered in snow. When the bomb cyclone's lethal mix of blizzard and rain then hit our state, an enormous quantity of water and ice and collected topsoil sped down the hard land like a furious slurry into the rivers and creeks and reservoirs, and it burst through dams and levees and other structures that normally would hold this back. Madam Speaker, it is pretty hard to get the mind around what a 500-year event actually means. But as I was standing at the ridge on Offutt Air Force Base, which is located right south of Omaha near the confluence of the Platte and Missouri rivers, I could see how the unprecedented force of water covered a third of that entire base and many communities in eastern Nebraska. As the rushing water hit the bank on the other side of the river, on the Iowa side, it blew it out and created a 62-foot deep hole. As a member of the Appropriations Committee here in Congress, I turned to the commander of the Corps of Engineers who was with me, and I looked at him and I said, "What's the number?" He immediately shot back without hesitation and said, "It's going to be a lot." Now, a little bit down the road to the west is the town of Fremont, and Mayor Scotty Getchman, a dedicated local public service servant who's in the heating and air conditioning business as his main job. He brought out a 1940 map of the old river channel of the Platte River. The problem for this town of Fremont began when the river got a bit nostalgic and sought to its old ways. In a place now named Ground Zero near the Rod and Gun Club west of town, massive chunks of ice and the pressure of the Platte blew the levee. Water began to find its own channels and multiple breaches, and the southern part of that town, Fremont, endured serious flooding. We surveyed the damage from a freshly patched hole, from remnants of an old hog confinement lot. That's recycling at its highest, and the old Scribner Air Base. An initial call for help in the community brought 250 people out. Shortly thereafter, 1,000 people showed up to sandbag. One man moved his car to higher ground because he could see what was coming, but then it was later swept away by the raging river. And he spent the next few days at the intersection directing traffic as a volunteer. Madam Speaker, a bit west of this town of Fremont is the small town of North Bend, and that's where a ditch dike could not contain itself and made its own channel, creating fingers of water flowing throughout the city. And the vast majority of homes in this small community were hit. The paved streets looked like mud streets by the time I got there, but even with 6 inches of water inside of it, the North Bend Eagle, the local newspaper, figured out a way to get that addition out. Realizing that he was in a critical spot, the North Bend school superintendent transformed the entire school, really one of the newer buildings, into a center of gravity for emergency operations. And though school was canceled, it didn't mean the kids weren't busy. Initially, they sandbagged. Then they began to volunteer for days on end with the cleanup effort. The people of North Bend organized themselves, and word spread. goods poured in from all over the country. And as the superintendent told me, he said, what was happening there could make a good country song. They would have so much appreciation for Nebraska. Areas south of Columbus, the town of Columbus, a little bit further to the west, were also particularly hard hit with very large ag and mounting ag losses, the most visible sign of which were dead cattle. In fact, this past Saturday, I went to a high school fundraiser in Columbus, and along Highway 81, the speed signs were still bent over like this with grass attached to them, showing the magnitude and the volume of water that rushed over that area. There's a truck stop there named T-Bones, Madam Speaker, and it greets passersby with two enormous cowboy boots on poles embedded in concrete. One was found 300 yards away at Matulka's garage. The other one was across the highway about a half a mile away. They'll probably be put back up to greet passersby once again. By the time, again, I got there, the 4 feet of mud and water had receded and a lot had been cleaned up. I looked at Fred, I said, how'd this happen? He said, this is T-Bones. We don't mess around. We're Nebraskans. We get things done. On a more positive note, Madam Speaker, a federal project initiated after the last flood of 2011 saved the little town of Schuyler, Nebraska, and a couple of other things positively have happened. Nebraska's congressional delegation asked for expedited assistance, and the president granted it, emergency disaster, or designation of federal emergency disaster. Even in the midst of this trauma, but Nebraskans found a way to get a few laughs. Again, along the fence across from that truck stop of T-Bones, there was a hand-painted sign that said, "Mud Wrestling Tomorrow." Back at Offutt Air Force Base, it's a pretty jarring scene when you see a large fuel tank lifted up and turned on its side. It shows you the powerful force of this water. As many of you have, many of the Congress members who have experienced this have had the same outpouring of support from family and friends around the country. I wanted to tell you just a quick few things that happened to me. A nun from Rome wrote to me and offered her prayers. A congressman from another area of the country texted me and said, I'll send my staff, whatever you need. The Jordanian ambassador to the United States contacted me with her concerns. Madam Speaker, as you and I have seen firsthand, a natural disaster can create certain blessings in disguise. It's a time when we can come together and put aside any political differences and lend a helping hand to our fellow citizens. And I think that's exactly what America wants Congress to do right now. Put our differences aside, find consensus, quickly pass a supplemental to simply help my constituents and the others who have been so devastated by these unpredictable, unforeseen events. Many have waited and waited, and I think this is the time. I yield back to the gentleman. Thanks so much.